So I'm so excited to introduce our first panel of change makers and champions for this work, and couldn't think of a better moderator for this conversation, my dear colleague, friend, personal shiro, Kendra Freeman, who's our, yes, clap it up for Kendra. Kendra is our Vice President of Programs and Strategy at Metropolitan Planning Council, and I just want to pass it off to you to get us started.
Thanks, Chandra. Wow, hi. Good afternoon. It's good to see people in person, and thanks for all of you who are joining us online as well. I was sitting here feeling both completely filled up and very humbled in listening to the journey that we've taken over the last 5 years and all the things that we've done and all the things that we still have to do. There's a lot more work that we need to do, but I think in true elevated fashion, we'll continue to move forward together. So again, my name is Kendra Freeman. I work at the Metropolitan Planning Council, but I'm also a steering committee member of Elevated Chicago. And as a founding member of Elevated Chicago, this partnership and this coalition has been just a really core part of MPC's ETOD work over the past 6 years. In July, the city of Chicago passed the Connected Communities Ordinance, which we've talked about a lot. We're going to dig into that when we get into this panel conversation. But the ordinance sought to amend the city's zoning code and to make development near transit, one, easier, by expanding development incentives to a larger geography and also including targeted bus routes, to make it more accessible by improving pedestrian safety near stations and setting parking thresholds to prioritize people over cars, and also to make it more equitable by increasing affordability incentives across the city and requiring an up or down vote on affordable housing proposals. So I'm excited to moderate this discussion with colleagues and friends who were really pivotal in not just helping to craft and to pass the legislation, but also are really important in helping us to continue to support its implementation. So help me in welcoming our panel. First, we have Commissioner Marisa Novara with the Chicago Department of Housing. You can clap. Christian Diaz, Director of Housing at Palenque, LSNA. Liz Butler, partner at Taft Law. And Phillip Beckham, Principal Managing Partner with P3 Investments. So thanks all of you for joining us for this conversation. I know one of the things that I love about Elevated Chicago is how we've really tried to broaden the table and really enable a true cross-sector collaboration, really bringing a diverse group of folks together to work towards a collective goal of equitable development in the city. So would love to know a little bit about you and what brought you to the Elevated Chicago table. And we can start with Phillip.
Are we on? Thanks. Thank you. So what brought me here on this 3-year journey, I've been a developer for about 3 years, is an opportunity to change my neighborhood, which is Brownsville, specifically 43rd Street, right at the Green Line station. Didn't know anything about TOD, but I understood once I got involved that it is critical to changing a neighborhood at its core, which is transportation. Our project 43 Green is exactly what that is. It brings opportunity for affordable housing and market rate. And as a developer, it eliminated about $2 million from our project for not having to have the parking because it is literally at the train station. And I didn't really get it until we put our website out for people to sign up, and we have over 300 for a 100-unit building. And it's for people like I have children in their 20s, and they don't drive, and it's a good thing they don't. But the transit is what they use. They use trains, they use the L, they use the buses, they use Divvy. And it's literally 50 feet away, and the TOD has made that possible, made zoning much easier. Commissioner and her team has really made it much easier for her, even as we go with the second phase. And it's extremely important to our community, our neighborhood, and the neighborhood gets it.
Great.
So
thank you. And Christian, why don't we jump over to you? What brought you to the Elevated Chicago table?
Sure. My name is Christian Diaz. I'm Director of Housing at Palenque LSNA. And we believe that all people, no matter the race, the income, deserve the opportunity to succeed in school and in life. And that means having a stable home. And now that means having a stable home near transit. I think of the 3-flat that my family and I grew up in. And living near the Logan Square Blue Line station meant that we had opportunities to find work downtown, to find work at O'Hare, so many amenities that are walkable to us. And now, in 2020, the 2020s, the pain of gentrification and displacement, it's becoming more and more unaffordable to live near transit. And so as we talk about transit-oriented development, specifically equitable transit-oriented development, we have to consider, well, who deserves to live near transit? And the work that we do is to ensure that all people have those benefits.
Great, wonderful. Liz, would you like to share?
Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. Today, my name is Liz Butler. I'm a land use attorney at the law firm of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister. I'm a land use attorney, so my role in development is helping property owners and developers navigate zoning and city policies, practices to get their projects through approval processes and built. My path intersected with Elevated Chicago last year when I was asked to work on a project in the city that I thought was a total loser. And it was a loser. It was turned down by the city council by the time I was involved, and it spurred a series of lawsuits on the part of the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, the property owner, lots of litigation. So by the time I got involved, this was not a good starting place. Luckily, we had great partners from the mayor's office, the Department of Housing, the Department of Planning and Development, who wanted to see a parking lot turned into a multifamily residential development with around 300 apartments, 60 of them being affordable. That project, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into the approval of that project and lobbying and securing the votes. MPC was instrumental, as was Elevated Chicago and the other partners that I identified. But what's interesting is that if the Connected Communities Ordinance had been in place at that time, I would not have had the anxiety that I did about whether that project would have been placed on an agenda for a public hearing before the Committee on Zoning, because that is one of the tools in the toolbox that the Connected Communities Ordinance now offers. So that's how I got here.
Great, thank you. And Commissioner?
Can somebody remind me what year the Cubs won the World Series?
I think it was 2016.
2016? Are you serious? So I have this memory of taking the underground tunnels from MPC over to CCT to because you did not want to step foot on public ground that day when they had the parade. It was the day they had the parade. And it was Mike Davidson, Joanna Trotter was then at the trust, it was Andy Gear, and we were all sitting around writing the grant that to Spark to fund the Elevated Chicago Collaborative. So that's my placement of it, is right around when the Cubs won. And so we, I see in my head Mike and Joanna as the leads of getting that done, but there were a bunch of us who helped, and we all believed really, really strongly in it. And we're so excited when Roberto came on board to lead it, and have just kind of been cheering that effort on ever since. And so that's my beginning story, my origin story with Elevated Chicago.
I certainly consider you kind of an OG of Elevated Chicago. So. But your leadership has been pivotal to advancing this work ever since we started, particularly the Connected Communities work when we started in 2019 with the ETOD policy plan. So can you talk a little bit about why we need a Connected Communities Ordinance and how the policy actually came to be?
Yes, I would love to. I also want to just note that there is a lovely crew of folks from the Department of Housing right back there. Yes, and they've all been, they are instrumental to this work too. So let me start with why we need this, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about how it came to be. So why do we need this? Well, I don't have to tell this group of people that we have a massively inequitable city, period. I can just stop there. And then in particular, we see very inequitable patterns of development across the city. So we looked at this with Elevated Chicago from the time that the TOD ordinance was first passed in 2013 until 2019. 90% of all of the developments that took advantage of the incentives under the TOD ordinance were on the north side or the west loop or downtown. As if there isn't abundant transit on the south and west sides, right? But we were not seeing developers take advantage of those incentives, which leads me to think two things. One, what do we need to be doing differently as government, as those are places where you most often are going to need subsidy to make developments work? And two, what do we need to change in our laws to make this just work better, to make it logical for people to take advantage of it, right? So what's exciting for me is that both of those things are changing. On the one hand, groups like Phil's partnership with Habitat, folks like Leon Walker and the work that he's doing near transit stops in Woodlawn and Englewood, that wasn't happening back in, when the first TOD stuff was getting passed. And so I really want to just highlight how exciting that is and how needed and important it is. The other thing is that I think we as government needed to do things differently, and we are. So in our last funding round, we announced 24 different affordable housing developments. 18 of those were equitable transit-oriented development, but what I'm most proud of is that 12 of those 18 were on the south and the west side. So we are saying our money goes where our mouth is on this, and this is important to us. The other thing I'll note as to why we need it, when we looked at this, when we were looking at the changes we wanted to make to the ordinance, there's a thing in Chicago called pedestrian streets. They make things much more safe for pedestrians, and they gave you already kind of an added bump to the radius around a transit station to which you could use the TOD incentives. But this is why it's important to unpack your data by race and geography, right? Of the 47 pedestrian streets that exist in Chicago, only 8 of them are on the south and west side. So not only is that much more unsafe for pedestrians on the south and west side, it also means that only in those other locations were people getting a back door into a much wider radius and a much bigger chance to do these kinds of developments. So stuff like that, that's why we needed it, right? We needed to put some things in motion so that no matter who is at the Department of Housing making funding decisions, we have legislation that says this is how we operate as a city. I think there was a second part to your question,
yes.
But I've also talked for a long time already, so.
The second part was what made this process different, and if you want to say a little bit about that, and Christian, I think you can also tag team on that as well, because you've been here for this entire process as well.
Yeah, I think so. What made this process different goes back a little bit to what came before it. So this has been a series of incremental processes. 2013 was the first TOD ordinance. 2015, it was strengthened. Actually, I was at MPC at that time, and we worked on, we doubled the radius to a quarter mile. We got rid of some parking minimums, things like that. But really, and Kendra, you were involved then in the next iteration, right at the beginning of 2019, another step was taken on this ordinance to say, we want to include bus lines, and we're pushing the city, we're mandating that the city create a policy plan for equitable TOD, right? And that really put in motion the need to do that. And that plan that Elevated and company, pulled together 80 stakeholders and worked really closely with some folks. I see Nina Idamudia from DPD worked really hard to bring this to Plan Commission in 2021, and that plan passed Plan Commission. That gave us the roadmap to say,
now we need an ordinance that enacts what's in that and makes it actionable in our zoning code. And so at that point, we had the entire elevated coalition saying, all right, guys, let's do this. And I have to say, from my perspective, it was such a different experience than I said this to the group. We've passed 8 ordinances in 3 years, and all but one of them, I would say, has been not only a frustrating experience, which I think just passing legislation, period, you're never going to engineer that out. That's just what it is. It's frustrating. But it was also kind of lonely, to be honest. It is a hard thing to carry the weight of getting something done, which most people are going to criticize you for, from one camp or the other camp. And what I said to the group on this one, it was still frustrating, absolutely, but it was not lonely. It was the most collaborative, all hands on deck effort. So between everyone in this coalition, what that would mean is I'd call up Alderman X, and Alderman X would say, oh, I already heard from so-and-so, who I went to grade school with. He brought in a whole crew of people, and we talked about this. I get it. I just have one question. So I'm like starting from a totally different place than if I was just calling this person cold, you know? Andrea mentioned that, you know, in the interim, CCT had developed a whole policy arm, and they activated their arm through Yana and got the board invested. We had multiple departments across the city, including Dr. Arwoody's team, CDOT, DPD, and for the first time, I've never had developers join. We had Phil and company join a briefing with the Black Caucus. They joined a press conference that we did. They spoke in the actual committee. Those are not things I've ever asked folks to do before, in part because you know, there was just a level of support and an outcry for this that was pretty singular.
So Christian, you are a community leader and activist, and a lot of what you do is holding public officials accountable. Tell us what, from your perspective, what was different about this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognize that segregation is a serious problem in Chicago. And it's not just segregation between communities, but also often segregation between social movements and organizations. And there's an ugly history in Chicago of city pitting communities against each other, specifically Black and brown communities. And what I think was unique about this campaign is that Elevated Chicago really did the legwork of establishing trust between different communities, building solidarity, building a shared analysis around transit, around the environment, around racial equity. And so that to me was very unique and definitely a breath of fresh air. I also want to appreciate that at Palenque LSNA, we believe that racial healing is a matter of public policy. And the first step in healing is recognizing that there's something to heal in the first place. And we can't heal what we can't see, right? So this ordinance is really special to me because it really speaks to an uncomfortable truth in Chicago, or many truths in Chicago. We live in a city where life expectancy can be correlated with your zip code, with race. A city where planning has served to destabilize Black and Indigenous communities for hundreds of years. And it's not just that planning has harmed our communities, it has to be recognized that violence toward people of color, especially when it comes to land use policy, is incredibly profitable. People make money off of our harm, and people become wealthy from displacing people of color. And so wealth is generated from harm. So this ordinance is special because it names things that are obvious but often unsaid. And the way that planning and development in Chicago has happened historically has been very harmful. But here we are trying to tackle this very serious historic issue and making progress. So I'm so proud to be a part of this collaborative.
Yeah, beautifully spoken. Where have you seen benefits to your community?
Well, there are some older people who want to do the right thing. They share our values, share our analysis, but there are very loud, vocal, not so friendly people in their wards as well, who will organize outcries and threaten to pull money and resources from these campaigns or to run a candidate. And so recently I had an alderperson call and say, hey, Christian, there's this person who really wants to convert this 3-flat near Transit into a single-family home. And I don't know what to say because the block seems to be really organized and they seem to be opposing this. And I want to be really democratic in how I make zoning decisions. And you know what I got to say? Well, she can't really do that. Because of this new ordinance, the option of converting that 3-flat into a single-family home, that loss of gentle density, that loss of naturally occurring affordable housing just isn't allowed anymore. And so it really saves a lot of time for us who are organizing to build public will and public support. And I'm just happy that I had that response, right, for that alderperson.
So good checks and balances. Interesting. Phillip, it's not often we see community leaders, developers, and the city agree on policy changes. From a real estate development perspective, why was this important to you? And what are you seeing in terms of local impacts in the industry?
Yeah, first of all, I didn't know that was not the norm. Because yeah, exactly. I didn't know that wasn't norm for developers to be involved with the city in bringing on new ordinances. My thought has always been, we can't do this alone. We need as much team collaboration as possible, and the city had a great ordinance that didn't just help us. There are two. I mentioned one some time ago that was trying to build a 3-flat, and because of this ordinance, before the ordinance, they couldn't. They had to match parking, and it just wasn't feasible for them, and they were just going to give up and actually sell and move. But the ordinance now, in fact, they called me up and said, we can do it now. And it's another family that's going to live, the whole family's going to live there. They're building it now. And then just another one came up. I go to a little coffee shop in Brownsville called Sip and Savor on 43rd, and there's a daycare center about 100 feet away. And she's had it for about 20 years, beautiful building, 1-story. And she said, I got to move because I can't build on it. I said, no, wait a minute. Yes, you can. She wanted to leave something for her kids, and they didn't want the daycare. And so we brought the architect in right there. In fact, he was in the coffee shop there. And I told him, we went to the building, and he said, no, we can do this. This ordinance made it possible to you can build up, and you can have apartments there, and you have the parking is established, and you don't have to spend more for parking. So it's taking immediate effect.
I love that synergy of making kind of like those very local connections around very tangible projects. What do you think developers kind of need to really understand the potential around this ordinance? Like, is it developers talking to developers and helping them kind of understand?
It's developers actually knowing the community they're working in.
Okay.
That's always been it. I know the community I work in. Again, I didn't know this didn't happen, but I think it's good that I'm new, that I don't have that history, and I think that's why our project and people are comfortable talking to me, because they've never seen developers face to face, especially on a project like ours.
Yeah.
And I go to the same spot that I went to before I was a developer, and now they can ask those questions, and I can give them the information immediately. I can point out that what the commissioner has done and what Alderman Dowell is always pushed for is keeping people there, repopulating an area, and not having those vacant lots anymore. That was, people talk about visionaries. My only vision was not to see vacant lots.
Yeah.
And not to have to drive to Hyde Park all the time or South Loop, and have our own place we can walk to and enjoy each other's company in the neighborhood. So that's a list I've had before 15 years.
Yeah.
So nothing new.
Spending time in community with community.
Exactly.
Critical to doing good work.
Exactly. So,
thank you for raising that up.
Yeah.
Liz, you're a zoning attorney, so I know you get into the weeds of the policy changes. I know we're about 4 months into this ordinance, and you've been working with the city to help kind of look at how it's working in the real world. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing, what you're learning, what may be some of the challenges as well as the surprises as you're digging into implementation?
Yeah, I would love to. So I sometimes describe my job as being a parking attorney because so many zoning and development matters just revolve entirely around parking, especially when communities or elected officials want to push back against density or projects with affordable housing. Parking seems to be one of the neutral ways to object to a project. What has been just, I consider the Connected Communities Ordinance to be like a new toolbox. And every day I'm learning these new tools and how to apply them to projects. And one of the amazing tools that this ordinance offers is projects that have 50% of affordable housing on site have a 0 parking requirement. And so it just makes it so much easier to navigate a zoning process. Projects that might have previously needed to go through a public zoning legislative process now can be approved administratively by staff, which means that the alderman doesn't have to put themselves publicly out there as supporting something and potentially risking objections from the neighbors. So that the adjustments to parking requirements are a lifesaver that make projects that previously may have died because of neighbor objection or otherwise. It makes them possible. So that's amazing.
And what challenges have you been seeing?
Like I said, this is an amazing toolbox, and we keep discovering new things all the time. This is a dense ordinance. I thought about printing it out and bringing it with me, but it's a 40-page zoning text amendment. I can't think of a more substantial overhaul to the zoning ordinance since maybe the 2004 rewrite of the code. But there's a lot in there, and zoning ordinances are intended to apply broadly to all projects, and sometimes there are projects that don't fit within the exact regulations of the code and that need modifications, and that's why you get an administrative adjustment, or you go to the Zoning Board of Appeals to seek relief. So there are some specific fact patterns that weren't anticipated by the Connected Communities Ordinance. I'll throw an example out there. The new ordinance requires 1 bicycle parking space per dwelling unit. A project that I'm working on right now is an accessible, all accessible, barrier-free project for people who have disabilities and are not riding bicycles.
Sure.
So there wasn't programmed into that project a bicycle parking space for every dwelling unit. The code doesn't currently offer an adjustment to that, but it will. We'll figure out a tweak going forward, and there will be little cleanups. But that happens anytime there's a significant legislative change like this one.
Great.
Yeah.
And it's really important to get that car out of the driveway and drive it and figure out early what the challenges are so those tweaks can be made. You brought up the issue around parking and density, and we know parking and density can be a sensitive topic in Chicago, how we feel about our parking spaces. And it can be hard sometimes talking about increasing density and reducing parking for both community residents and for older people. So oftentimes there's resistance. I know I've definitely had to facilitate some of those conversations as well. But these are really cornerstones of what TOD is really all about. So I'm interested, and I'll open this up to the entire panel, of how do you address that resistance when you're in conversation and you're trying to help communities and counsel people understand the importance of building density in neighborhoods?
I'll take a shot at it.
Sure.
Because I had to go through it. The neighbors who have been there for 25, 35 years, and even new neighbors, when they saw the size of the building, you can talk about it, but then when they see the size of the building, the first thing and I attend all the homeowners association meetings, all the block club meetings via Zoom or personally. So when they bring it up, it's going to be cars, there's going to be people, there's going to be so many, it's going to be just traffic, and what are you going to do about it? I said, here's what we're going to do about it. We all get in our cars and drive to Hyde Park or South Loop, and we complain about there's no parking and the traffic's terrible. But then when we get in the restaurant, the first thing we say is, how come we don't have this in our neighborhood? I said, you can't have it both ways. So that basically ended that conversation. I said, if you want your own restaurants that you can walk to, you want your own UPS stores, or you want everything that every other neighborhood has, this is what you have to work with. So now that conversation doesn't come up anymore. They look forward now to finding out which restaurants, who's moving in. And I said, just imagine Hyde Park, 53rd Street with public transportation, because there is no public transportation other than Woodlawn and Lake Park. We have an L station right in the middle of what we're talking about. So after about 3 or 4 months of interacting and having those exchanges, now I don't get any complaints about traffic. They just want to know when everything's going to open. So that was, you had to, because I lived it. We all did it. We all were driving, complaining, then how come we don't have this? And we know we can't have it both ways.
I love how you started that off by saying you went to every block club meeting and every homeowner association.
Still do. And when they have questions, I tell them, don't ask me, go ask the construction guys, go talk to Melissa. You know, I'm outside. You can go right there and talk to them. So it's been a developer. I don't consider myself that at that site. I'm part of that neighborhood, and they know me. So it's made it a more of a community. It's not just a building to them. It's a community property now. They're part of it.
Yeah. You look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think you raised some really important points, and those points are made both sincerely and insincerely at the community level, right? Around concerns about density and concerns about parking. And I think if let's take a sincere concern about density, and let's acknowledge that in this city we have done density very badly. And in many ways that comes from a very racist history of saying we're going to put folks who need to be in public housing in way, 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 way bigger buildings with not enough resources and not enough care for the buildings, and isolate them. And then when we tear those all down and we say we're going to build a dense building, people may have some real concerns, right? And so lots of times that's raised as a insincere thing. And in my own community, we had didn't we learn anything from the projects? I was like, yeah, we did. That's why this is 60 units, not 6,000. Let's not falsely compare things here, right? We're not talking about the same things. We did learn from that, and we aren't doing that. And the other thing is, and I know this from years of working at MPC, which is a regional organization, every single place thinks they need more parking than they do. It's just a universal. And even when you pull out data, I've used this data from CNT from 2016 that found all these, parking structures near transit that are half empty. In many ways, I think data is important, but lots of times people just can't hear it. And so I do think there's something really important about just taking certain things off the table. Right? And that's what's important about this kind of legislation. It's like, we're going to have a conversation about how we do this, not if we do it. Yes, it's going to be a taller building, so let's talk about how. Let's talk about what it should look like. Yes, it's going to have less parking, period. We're not debating that. But let's talk about how much less, and right? So let's right-size the conversation. It's a how, not an if.
Liz, did you have a comment?
Yeah, another thing that I think is kind of transformational about this ordinance, not just facilitating these larger, higher density projects, but facilitating what I call gentle density in the neighborhoods. Christian mentioned a 3-flat that was proposed to be converted to a single-family home. I'm, because of this ordinance, working on a single-family home that's being converted into a 7-unit building that otherwise could not have been done. No parking. In a high opportunity area, well served by transit. That was done without going through a public legislative process, an administrative process only. And that fact pattern can replicate itself over and over again in these neighborhoods. When we're talking about density, I also like to mention this gentle density concept. That's really important.
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm wondering, for any of you, are there other things that are coming to mind that feel like this is really embodying the transformative opportunities around the ordinance, like particular projects or particular things that are in the pipeline or opportunities in the pipeline?
Well, I can speak of how transit-oriented development used to happen in neighborhoods like mine, like Logan Square. And I think of a building called Logan's Crossing, which is at the former site of the Mega Mall, which was this indoor market that our residents loved to go to on the weekends. And I was always really confused as to why this building that only had like 10% affordable units, but it has like 300 parking spots for a Target, could be considered transit-oriented development. And so I think there's some nuance that has to be explored around questions of density and parking. I think what's transformative about this is, again, kind of removing that debate on whether or not a development should be equitable or as equitable as possible. I want to live in a Chicago where inequity is not an option anymore, right? So I think I do also see that this ordinance really speaks to how policy in Chicago, but really nationally, it's not about who has the best idea or who has the best data or the best messaging. It really comes down to power. And we saw a lot of resistance to the most progressive parts of our ordinance because there are people in power who are very invested in the status quo, which we don't like, right? And so I just want to reiterate that we need to take power in Chicago. The city elections are coming up February 28th. Historically, there's very low voter turnout. But what does our city do? They manage a $14 billion budget every year and approve it. And so do we feel like these funds are geared towards equitable development or equitable schools or equitable planning or all the things that are very popular in this room? If you feel like the answer is no, then we need to have more people in power who agree with us. And that takes deep conversations and community organizing. So one thing that's really transformative, I think, about this policy is just the opportunity to go back to our community and say, look, we won. And so we have to do more of this.
Yeah. I want to build on kind of that note of, there was some resistance to some things in this ordinance. And even though it was hard, it was a lot of work to pass it. And even though we're really excited about what we got passed, there were some things that, that didn't happen. So I would like to know, what are the things that the ordinance is not addressing that you wish it addressed? And how do you think that will shape your work moving forward? And that's an open question to the panel. And perhaps Commissioner Novara wants to start with that.
Well, we were very clear inside inside City Hall that we wanted the mayor to introduce an ordinance that covered what we wanted to get passed. And we knew that we might not be able to pass everything in that ordinance, but we wanted to be clear about what our priorities were coming out of the policy plan. And in fact, we did have to take some things out of it that we did not have council's support for. And I guess my experience passing legislation in this town is that it's a series of proving that the sky didn't fall, and then you come back, right? It's like over and over and over again. You show that the thing you wanted to do, maybe you had to pare it down, and then you show that it didn't, the sky's still above us, and you come back and say, so maybe let's try to revisit for the other thing is, the other thing I've learned is that you go as far as you can with the council you have in the moment that you're in, and then you can come back. One of the quotes I have on my wall is, sometimes you have to fight a battle more than once to win it. And the thing that, Christian is talking about is, what are the levers you can pull to either change the moment or change the people that are in power who objected to the things that we ultimately had to take out, right? Those are the things we can control. It's like, how do you change the moment of what people feel they need to respond to? That's something in the control of folks in their communities, right, to mandate that. And LSNA has done an amazing job of that. I mean, the elected officials that represent your geographies listen to you. right? And that doesn't exist everywhere, but it could if we had the support and the organizing and all of that. So those are the things that I reflect on, is like, that's absolutely as far and not 1 inch more as we could get in July of the year of our Lord 2022, right? That doesn't mean we couldn't revisit it. It's just, but that was exactly what we could do in that moment.
I don't know yet from the developers, but we like the niche we're in around train stations, and sadly, and good for us, but sadly, there's so many vacant properties around train stations on the south and west sides. That's where we're going to stay.
Yeah, what I will add, and to Commissioner Novara's point, is that this is an ongoing campaign, right? An ongoing effort. But one thing that was really exciting to me about the original language of the ordinance is that over and over again, we've seen amazing 100% affordable housing proposals get buried in Chicago simply because the alderperson doesn't want to have a hearing or a vote on that development. And the original language of the ordinance called for a hearing within 6 months and a vote within 6 months. But through the dealing and all the things that come up in policy making, we had to make a compromise, right? Because we needed to pass something. And the compromise is 12 months. So within 12 months, there has to be a vote on an all affordable proposal. And that's a shame, because we know, these folks know, right, how fragile these proposals can be, and having to wait 12 months with uncertainty on whether or not there's going to be a hearing or a vote is really sad. So I think there definitely has to be a sequel, a part 2.
Yeah. What do you think's on the docket for part 2? I mean, we are kind of at a moment of change with a number of city council members retiring, and so the city council can look very different after spring of 2023. So
I think the commissioner is going to have to be a great teacher, because the learning curve is going to be, hopefully not longer than 3 years, so they can understand where it needs to go and how far the next steps.
Lizzie, right?
Zoning reform is happening nationwide, and there are municipalities that are further ahead of us, and they're setting, the model and the precedent. Other cities have eliminated parking requirements altogether. We didn't go that far. Other communities have eliminated single-family zoning altogether.
Yep.
We didn't get there, but I think this is the beginning of the process and not the end. So
maybe some beacon of where we might be going in the next couple of years. Wonderful. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I did want to ask another question, and I think at some point we have some questions that are coming in from the online Zoom room. Is that right? Okay. So I guess in thinking about the past experience, I know you guys have come in at different points. What is like the key learning, or like what are you taking away from all this, either from the policy plan or the advocacy process or the implementation? Like what kind of stands out to you as a key learning? It could be professionally and kind of personally in doing this work, because we know this is long work. This is not short work, and it takes internal fiber to continue to push this work forward. So I'm just curious, how are you thinking about what you've learned and what your personal experience has been over the last couple of years working around this ordinance and moving this beacon of equitable development forward for the city of Chicago?
Personally, it's just the immediate change in people in their lives. The two examples I gave, that was very personal for them. That was family lineage, and this has been in effect 4 months, 3 months, and it affected them immediately in a positive way. So, if it happened that 2 times that I know of, how many other times has it happened that I don't know of? And that's the great satisfaction of me being a part of it, of seeing the change happen.
Yeah, and capturing that story and magnifying those
Yeah.
so we can get more
Yeah.
of them. Yeah, that's great.
My observation is that we can do really hard things by building coalitions. I mentioned that project that got approved by the Cumberland Station. We had 100 letters of support. We had partners calling all of their relationships on the city council. The same way that the Connected Communities Ordinance was passed, it was introduced and then it was passed the next month. That was remarkable and was not what I had predicted would happen, but all of the groundwork had been laid through the coalition that was built over many years.
I would say that discussing racial equity or inequities, it's really uncomfortable and it's inconvenient. And we have to remember what we risk when we don't challenge some of the dominant narratives that surround development. And what we risk is our planet, our future. We risk the lives of our people. And so what I'm learning through this campaign and through others is that we really have to continue to lean into this discomfort, because liberation is uncomfortable work, but it's so, so worth it.
What are you taking away from this experience, either personally or professionally?
I think something I want to build on something that Christian said that I do think I have learned more about in this role, which is some elected officials really do want to do the right thing and they need some cover to do it. And it isn't as simple as just saying you should just do it. I mean, sure, but how can we make it easier for people to do the things we want them to do is a valid question for us to spend some time on, because, and some of that comes down to all of us. I mean, I don't know, like, your experience with this. Recently, I got a letter in the mail from my alderman about a community meeting they were doing about an affordable housing proposal. We happen to be funding it, but it is, you also get it as a resident, right? And it was come to this community meeting about it, and I realized, like, oh, this is a moment where lots of people would read this letter and be like, oh, I'm fine with that. That sounds fine. I don't need to go, and toss it aside, right? Whereas, trust me, the people who think this is bringing Armageddon to the city of Chicago will be there in force, right? So give your alder person some cover to say, hey, there's a mix of views here tonight. I'll take all of these into consideration, right? Otherwise, it is really, really hard to say, I'm going to ignore each and every one of you and go the opposite way. So we all have to give some of that so that there's a different path to take. And you know, the other thing that I'll say very specifically to this ordinance is that something that was surprising to me, and I didn't think I was naive on this issue, but it did surprise me that some of the strongest pushback that we got on certain measures came from parts of the city where you would see hate has no home here and Black Lives Matter signs in their front yard. And that really took me aback and really made me think, what do we need to be doing differently here, and thinking about differently, acting differently when we want to make the kinds of changes we're trying to make here. And it goes back to the point I made earlier with Palenque, LSNA, and others about how do you build power in communities that have a different vision.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we have about 10 minutes to invite the audience into this conversation. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to the panel, please stand up, raise your hand, and I don't know if we have a mic, but if hopefully you can project loud enough we could hear you. Yeah, please stand up.
Good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Cody. I recently wrote a book all around gardening and different things we can do as community members. And so I'm really interested on how we continue to beautify these spaces. I've grown up on the south side of Chicago. You know, 43rd Street, I understand where you're talking about. And I can remember growing up and going downtown and seeing all the beautiful stuff out for Christmas. And then I came back to my community, and it's the same it looks the same way, but it's Christmas out on the south side too. So I'm interested in knowing how are we continuing to grow these green spaces within the ordinance that you created?
We have green roofs. The space that we've made sure we cultivated to the south of our building, which is where our building bounds our nearest neighbor, we made sure we had those spaces. And because also 200 feet further south is Hadia Pendleton Park, which is a beautiful large space. But those were part of it, and that was part of the community input and what we thought we could get. Not a lot of space, a little dog walk for the people, and some green space. But our real intent is on the roofing, making sure we have the green roofs and things like that, if it can fit in the budget. But it does. We work it out. We get through. But in our buildings, like I said, it's a large. We fill up most of the space, but that's always part of how we can landscape and bring those spaces.
I'll just say one quick response, which is I really appreciate you raising that. It's easy as a housing person to get focused on housing, and that's not the sum total of what we all need in our lives, right? I will highlight that something they talked about in the video, that the city is funding a bunch of different pilot projects around the city. Catania, sitting right behind you, did a really cool pop project in their community, and a lot of the work that we're doing with Elevated Chicago on these pilots has to do with just what are we doing in these spaces more broadly, and not just the bricks and mortar, but how are people living in these spaces and using them and so on. So I think there's lots of room for that and appreciation for it, for sure.
I would also just throw out, if I may overstep, one of the things that we try to support at MPC is really neighborhood-based planning. So making sure that we have the resources for community to plan together. So we're thinking not just about housing and retail, but also the balance of green space. So as a more holistic plan. So, are there other questions? Oh, I see a hand in the back.
Hi, Aaron Johnson, Department of Housing. So in the video, they mentioned the JEDI cohort, Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, as a tool that you all use to help educate government leaders in racial equity and diversity and those things. Just hearing what you're talking about of how people in different communities still need that training or aspect or exposure to those things. One, I guess, like how do you think exposing different government leaders to having that shared language and shared experience helped advance the work of this? And then what are other ways or other industries or groups that we could also be cooperating in this space to make sure that we're all in this shared language that we can continue to advance like these equity goals forward? Thanks.
Any takers?
Thanks, Aaron. I do think that, and I'm looking at Dr. Arwady on this as well, I do think that this effort was one of how do we find the right people in the right departments to move this forward, right? And CDPH as a founding member of Elevated was, that was easy breezy, but a couple other places we had to really work at figuring out like who gets this from the standpoint. Nina, took DPD by storm and really got our whole ETOD like kind of aura with the planning and housing connection there was at its strongest, right? When Nina brought that forward, and then we found the right folks at CDOT. I mean, it is a matter though of like if we could do more of these JEDI cohorts and just spread the number of people who are kind of able to think in that way more, I think the more and more we could do. So that's a plug for funding more JEDI cohorts.
Christian, did you have something you want to say about that?
Yeah, DEI makes such a difference in the work. I know that when I get a call from DOH or CDPH, I'm like really excited to get emails from them. And there's other departments that I'm not going to name that don't seem to share that same commitment to DEI that, I get their email or their call, I'm like, oh God, okay, I'll respond in a week. So one thing I really appreciate about the departments that do take DEI seriously is that they recognize the brilliance and the beauty and the culture that already exists within Chicago, right? And what's so sad to me is that a young person can walk down the street in Garfield Park or Logan Square and feel like there's no place for them to have a say on what the streets look like and feel like. And I think what I'm really excited about in the future is more of this DEI work, more opportunities to bring in these brilliant perspectives, this lived experience into these departments and into this work, because it really makes a difference. I mean, right now, Logan Square is working with CMAP, and our lead planner is somebody who's from Chicago, who knows our community intimately. And it's a pleasure to work with them, right? It's a pleasure to work with DOH, with CDPH, because they take that DEI seriously. So please encourage your other department heads to do the same.
And I would also say a lot of the work that you've done over the past couple of years with the Equitable Development Ambassadors Program is really seeding a pipeline of people to be with those values and with those competencies to be able to step into that work. And quite honestly, I think a lot of that has happened over the past year. Commissioner Novara, Juan Sebastian, Nina, all of you guys were doing amazing work outside of the city, and you saw an opportunity to move and change things, and you took that brave leap to go over to the city side to do this important work. So thank you for that. I just wanted to do that shout out.
Is Juan Sebastian here?
I saw another hand over.
I know, I didn't see him.
He's here somewhere.
Okay, I should have mentioned him a long time ago if I didn't know he was here. Yes.
I saw one more hand over here. Was it? Yes.
I'm Ellen Partridge. I work with the Shared Use Mobility Center and with Equiticity. And so transportation is a really, really important part of this. We want to make it so that people can live well without having to have a car. And in Chicago, more rides are taken on buses than on trains. And so thinking about how does this work with the bus system, and how do you is that one of the improvements that you can make to have mobility hubs around bus centers? And I'm also curious about whether, how the transit agencies are engaged with this.
This ordinance did, and there's a great visual of it, but this ordinance did massively expand the number of bus routes that are covered, which we hope will result in more developments taking advantage of that. It has, to date, been mostly by rail stations, for sure. But there are big parts of the city that aren't served by rail, and we want to make sure that, that this is part of it. The other thing I'll say, since you asked about other agencies in the city, one thing that I'm really excited about, I know our partners in planning are as well, is for, I think, my entire professional career, we have been talking about expanding the Red Line south, right? And we're actually finally seem to be in striking distance of that, right? And yes, and long overdue. And so we are working closely, planning is working closely with us and CTA on, for the first time, we could actually have new rail stations that we could proactively plan around, because we've had most of our rail is, long since built out, and we just didn't have the opportunity to think about it in a new way. So there's a lot of land located near those proposed 4 Red Line stops, and how we would treat those and how we would plan around them is a really exciting opportunity that we are working across departments and agencies on.
I think we can take one more question. Yes. You had your hand up in the back.
Hi, Frank Zhu, City of Chicago. I work in IGA, and thank you again for speaking. I guess my question for you guys is, obviously the harms of, discrimination and redlining are pervasive across this country, not just in Chicago, but in cities all across. And so I'm imagining that a lot of, I think ETOD is a not necessarily novel concept, but a lot of cities probably haven't necessarily started the work, but are potentially thinking about it. I guess there's probably no playbook, but I did want to ask, were there examples that you guys kind of drew from, lessons that you learned from other cities? Were there, I guess, models that you kind of took? Or was, and I imagine like all of this, it sounds like has been a massive learning experience, but overall, like, was there anywhere you looked for this? And also, what would you share with the cities and towns and municipalities across the country that are looking to kind of replicate these kinds of policies? Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. There was a slide in our presentation to all the the aldermanic briefings we did, and then in the committee hearing that was essentially like, we're behind the times, guys. Here's what other cities are doing on these main categories that we are trying to move on. And I don't remember the specific examples off the top of my head. We hit that note really hard. What I will say is my experience is that folks often seem to feel that Chicago is a special snowflake of a city that from which lessons elsewhere could not possibly be relevant. And so it is hard. It's worthwhile, and we do it all the time. We say here that we're not breaking new ground here. Here's all the ways other cities are behind, but the data itself seems to need to come from here in order to feel like we can then build on it and do more. But so both are true. We do it, and then it also feels like we often need to, just as I ran through, we end up with an incremental approach because we have to show people that it's not as scary as it feels.
Liz, did you have any thoughts about models? I know you mentioned a couple folks who were ahead of us earlier in your comments.
I could rattle off the names of cities, but I think Minneapolis eliminated single-family zoning. Charlotte, I think California did it at the state level. So there are a lot of examples of both cities and states. Connecticut didn't we talk about Connecticut at that symposium earlier this year? Stephen Vance.
Connecticut is doing something really interesting where they're mapping their entire state's zoning so they can figure out how segregated the entire state is, and then they're going to move to reform.
So there are many, many models, both at the city and state level. And I think, one of the challenges with zoning is this hyper local decision making. And so what some states are doing is taking some of the discretion out of the local level. And yeah, so there are a lot of examples to look at.
Other questions? I'm just waiting to get the hook up. Since it's not happening, I'm just going to keep going. I see a hand in the back. Yes.
I've got two questions, actually. Oh, it's hot mic. I'm curious if there were particular concessions that had to be made just in the passing of the ordinance, and if so, what are your thoughts on just continuing to address those? And then the other one is there a specific neighborhood or location in the city that any of you feel particularly excited about that will be very specifically impacted by the passing of this?
Yeah, my neighborhood. That's easy. Brownsville, 43rd and right at the Green Line. It's a tremendous impact. We're not done yet, but the impact is on the streets, Prairie, Indiana, all the Calumet, all those streets now, if you go 2 blocks either way, north or south, the vacant lots are being filled with new home structures, apartments, condos. So this project is not just affecting that piece of land right around the trains, it's affecting neighborhood 3-4 blocks around and even further. So it's a huge impact.
I know one of the concessions is a policy reform that's really important to Logan Square, and this is the idea of minimum density, which I first heard of from Juan Sebastian. who works for the mayor's office. And the idea is that if you look at a block and most of the block is multifamily housing, then the deconversion of a multifamily unit or building to a single family would be limited. And I was excited to see this minimum density policy apply to a much broader swath of Chicago than it does. But one of the concessions is that it only applies to gentrifying neighborhoods like Logan Square. And hey, it's a victory anyway, so I'll take it.
Okay, I think our time is up. I just want to ask you to join me in thanking my panel. Thank you so much.